A Boeing 737 had just taken off from Washington, D.C. Suddenly, a warning light came on. The plane began to descend. Alarms blared through the cockpit as the crew reacted quickly, but the aircraft was dropping too low, too fast. Cold wind roared past the fuselage, its body skimming dangerously close to rooftops. The fate of the 61 people on board hung by a thread. Could the pilot save the plane in time? This is the story of United Airlines Flight 553. December 8, 1972, Washington National Airport. 55 passengers and 6 crew members boarded a Boeing 737, operating as United Airlines Flight 553, bound for Chicago Midway International Airport on a non-stop flight. The flight crew consisted of 3 pilots, Captain Wendell Lewis Whitehouse, First Officer Kenneth Kruger, and Second Officer Barry Elders. Because flights departing from Washington National Airport often carried politicians traveling to major cities like Chicago, many passengers on Flight 553 had political connections. Among them was Chicago Congressman George Collins, as well as several people linked to the Watergate scandal. Dorothy Hunt, wife of one of the Watergate conspirators, was on board carrying $10,000 in cash. Also on the flight was CBS reporter Michelle Clark, who had been investigating the Watergate case. At 1:50 p.m. local time, Flight 553 departed from Washington, D.C. After climbing to a cruising altitude of 28,000 feet, the first hour and a half of the flight went smoothly. Then, calm turned to chaos. A warning light illuminated on the instrument panel, indicating a malfunction in the flight data recording system. The captain quickly instructed the second officer to investigate. By this time, Flight 553 was approaching Chicago Midway Airport, descending to 4,000 feet under air traffic control instructions. The flight was second in line to land, behind a slower twin-engine turboprop aircraft. To maintain safe separation from the plane ahead, air traffic control instructed Flight 553 to reduce speed to 180 knots, about 333 kilometers per hour. Soon after, controllers asked the pilots to slow further to 160 knots. To reduce speed, the crew extended the flaps to increase drag and pulled back on the engines. Then, air traffic control cleared Flight 553 to descend to 2,000 feet. The first officer radioed back, confirming, United 553 leaving 4,000, descending to 2,000. However, the captain had not yet begun the descent. He and the second officer were still focused on troubleshooting the flight data recorder malfunction. Even after receiving clearance to descent, Flight 553 remained level at 4,000 feet for about 35 seconds. When the captain finally initiated descent, his attention was still divided by the technical issue. He had lost overall situational awareness of the approach. By this time, the plane was rapidly nearing the outer marker, a key navigation point that signals the final approach phase. At this position, the aircraft should ideally have been at 1,500 feet. But the captain had set a descent rate of only 750 feet per minute, too shallow to reach the correct altitude in time. As the aircraft approached the outer marker, the crew extended the flaps to 30 degrees, an action meant to increase lift, but it unexpectedly caused the plane to momentarily level off, halting its descent. To make matters worse, the engine thrust was set too low to maintain airspeed in this configuration. The aircraft's speed dropped quickly, falling from 150 knots to 130 knots. Just before 2:26 p.m., the captain resumed the descent. When Flight 553 passed the outer marker, it was still at 2,200 feet, 700 feet higher than recommended. Realizing the aircraft was far too high, the captain made an abrupt correction, increasing the descent rate to 1,500 feet per minute, much steeper than a stable approach allows. To achieve this rapid drop, he deployed the speed brakes, panels that extend from the wings to disrupt airflow and reduce lift. The speed brakes are designed to create drag and slow the aircraft down. However, deploying them after passing the outer marker was highly unusual, a clear sign that the approach had already become severely unstable. But the issue wasn't just altitude control. The entire sequence of the approach was rushed and disorganized. After passing the outer marker, the captain finally called for the final descent checklist, a critical procedure that should have been completed earlier, before reaching that point. The delay reflected a major procedural breakdown. Under pressure, the first officer rushed through the checklist items. In the haste, he failed to closely monitor key flight parameters such as airspeed. The checklist was recited quickly.
Flight and nav, cross-checked. Landing gear, down 3 green. Speed brake, armed.
While answering, the first officer glanced briefly at the speed brake indicator light. But that quick look wasn't enough. In reality, the speed brakes were not armed, they were fully deployed. Unfortunately, the indicator light shows the same status whether the system is armed or fully extended. The first officer didn't physically check the position of the lever, relying instead on the light. That oversight planted the seed of disaster. At the moment the pilots finished the final descent checklist, the captain finally caught sight of the ground through a break in the clouds. He suddenly realized the aircraft was rapidly approaching the minimum descent altitude of 1,000 feet. According to procedure, the plane could not descend below this altitude without having the runway in sight. The captain immediately leveled off at 1,000 feet. But in this abrupt maneuver, he forgot to retract the speed brakes. With the speed brakes still fully extended, the plane began to lose airspeed rapidly, even in level flight. Worse still, the airspeed had already dropped below 130 knots, leaving almost no margin before an aerodynamic stall. Meanwhile, air traffic controllers were growing increasingly concerned about the shrinking distance between Flight 553 and the slower turboprop aircraft ahead of it. The controller grew increasingly worried that the small turboprop aircraft ahead might not clear the runway in time, leaving too little space for United Flight 553 to land safely. For a moment, the controller considered redirecting the turboprop to parallel runway 31 right, but soon realized it was too late to change its course. As a last resort, the controller urgently radioed,
United 553, execute a missed approach. Make a left turn to a heading of 180, climb to 2000.
At the exact same moment this order was issued from the tower, a chain of critical events unfolded inside Flight 553's cockpit. The captain noticed the airspeed dropping rapidly and immediately increased engine power from 59% to 75%. Almost at the very moment the controller said the words "execute," the aircraft's speed fell to a critically low level, triggering the stall warning system. The control column began to shake violently, a clear physical warning that the plane was nearing an aerodynamic stall. The overlapping of alarms and ATC instructions threw the cockpit into confusion. Both the captain and first officer scrambled to respond, unaware that the real cause of their speed loss was the fully deployed speed brakes, which still hadn't been retracted. Mistakenly believing the drag was caused by the flap configuration, the captain retracted the flaps from 30 degrees back to 15 degrees in an attempt to regain speed. But the move backfired. With less flap extension, the wings generated less lift, bringing the aircraft even closer to a complete stall. As the crisis deepened, the captain acknowledged the controller's missed approach instruction. Moments later, a voice in the cockpit was heard saying softly, "I'm sorry." It was the captain. He had finally realized his grave mistake. He desperately tried to recover, extending the flaps to 40 degrees, retracting the landing gear, and increasing engine thrust even further. But it was too late. None of these actions, not the flaps, not the gear, not the added power, could overcome the enormous drag still being caused by the unretracted speed brakes. The tragedy was now unavoidable. United Airlines Flight 553, at barely 400 feet above the ground, entered a complete aerodynamic stall. Its final moments had arrived. The plane shuddered violently, the nose pitched sharply upward, and the aircraft fell into an unrecoverable dive. Panic swept through the cabin. Terrified screams filled the air. The jet plunged straight toward the densely populated neighborhood below. In the cockpit, shouts of shock and despair echoed as the pilots fought desperately with controls that no longer responded. At such a low altitude, recovery was impossible. Though the captain finally recognized his fatal mistake and retracted the speed brakes, his correction came far too late. The Boeing 737's left wing clipped the top of a tall tree, then smashed through a detached garage before slamming directly into a two-story house in Chicago's southwest residential area. The impact was devastating. The house exploded instantly in a storm of bricks and debris. The plane's left wing sliced through the roof of the neighboring home like a blade. Still out of control, the aircraft tore across the street, crashing into 3 more houses and flattening them completely. Flight 553's fuselage broke apart in 2. The front section disintegrated upon impact. The first officer was killed instantly. Jet fuel sprayed outward and ignited into a massive fireball. Within seconds, towering flames engulfed both sides of the wreckage. Many people, including Captain Whitehouse, perished in the fire and smoke. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, concluded that the probable cause of the crash was the captain's failure to maintain the necessary airspeed and altitude parameters during a non-precision approach, resulting in a stall. The NTSB issued several safety recommendations to the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, including improving the speed brake indication system to prevent misinterpretation of its position, enhancing crew coordination and procedural discipline during non-precision approaches, strengthening training in cockpit resource management, CRM, to prevent loss of focus and divided attention among pilots,